Chapter 4. A Call to Adventure. Peppercorn didn't know who his parents were. He did not know where they were from, nor how he had come to be in Laketown. And if the missus or the skipper knew, they'd never let on. He did not know his real name. Peppercorn was the only name he'd ever known, just as the missus was the only mother he had ever known, and Laketown the only home. There had been a name, no doubt, some whispered name in a foreign tongue, unfamiliar and coarse. But if there was, it had not endured, not past the time the missus first clapped eyes on him, held him in her arms but a few days old, and, kissing the crown of his downy head, had declared the wrinkled little package, no bigger than a peppercorn to be sure. And so the name had stuck. Peppercorn he was, and Peppercorn he remained. Of course, he was not so small now, but he was not so very big either, but Peppercorn stuck with him all the same. And though the missus was the closest thing to a mother that Peppercorn could ever remember having, she had commented on many occasions that the child was never meant to be mothered, being a wild and feral creature, impossible to tame or confine within doors almost from the day he could crawl. Though the missus had resigned herself to the idea of taking in and rearing the babe as one of her own, what difference is one mouth more, especially one so small, when you have 7 hungry mouths already, she had asked. The little berry-coloured infant had a different idea altogether. He had been content to live in the Laidlaw's kitchen, sleeping in a blanket-lined fish crate before the stove. He'd been happy coddled and mothered as he was by the missus and Deirdre, her maid, who would give him the corner of a milk-soaked dishcloth to suckle. Happy, that is, until the day he had managed to climb out from his bed and crawl through the open door, out into the hustle and bustle of the Laketown morning. They had brought him back, of course. He was just a babe, but things continued in this way, day after day, month after month, for years, until the day the skipper was sent out to find the boy and bring him back home for his supper, only to discover he could not be found. It was probably for the best, the missus had mused. She had her own boys and enough on her hands what with looking after them. Honest and good though they were, they might take it ill to have a cuckoo in their nest. And there was no shortage of ragamuffins and waifs in Laketown neither. Where would she draw the line? If she took in one, why not the rest? No, she did what she could, bought fish from the boy, gave the odd item of clothing that her own boys had outgrown, the odd plate of leftovers, a copper coin when the skipper wasn't looking, and that would have to suffice for now. How he had first come to be at the skipper's, he did not rightly know. It had happened when he was but a baby, long before the time that he could remember. They had never made any pretence of his being anything but an orphan, the skipper and the missus, but they had never treated him any differently from their own children either, for all that. He was not sure who his real parents were or what had happened to them. What he did know was that he was different. His complexion, for a start, was altogether darker than the milk-white hue of the skipper's boys, and his eyes, as black as his glossy hair, suggested that if not he, then his parents had come from one of the cities of the south or east. And he was shorter in height too than the Laidlaw boys had been at his age, and thicker and stronger of limb. "'Tain't no matter the size of you," the missus had schooled him when younger. "'Tis the size of his deeds what makes the man." And she would nod her head sagely. And Peppercorn had believed her and taken the message to heart, and had never allowed his height to impede his actions, nor his stature to dictate what he could or could not achieve. And from that day until this, Peppercorn had borne as big and as heavy a load as any other boy employed upon the wharves of the city, and shouldered as weighty a responsibility as any of Laketown's adults or parents. The boy's only clue to his origins was a piece of smooth cream soapstone carved into the shape of a huntsman's horn, which, the missus had told him, had been tied onto a thong of leather around his waist when he had first come to her, and which now hung about his neck. There were some words inscribed on the smooth back, but what they said he did not know, nor did the skipper, the missus, or anyone else he had ever shown it to. They were in letters different to the ones he had been taught, and so any significance they might have had, or any light they might have shed upon his nativity, remained a mystery. That first day the skipper had come home without him wasn't his last under the Laidlaw's roof, not by a long chalk, but it marked the beginning of a more, shall we say, casual relationship between the boy and his surrogate parents. He came and went as he pleased. Sometimes they did not see him from one week to the next. Other times he was a nightly lodger, would hang around for some breakfast and then be gone again. Though the skipper would have willingly given him work alongside his own boys in his warehouse, as he had with Peterkin and Jinx before him, or upon his trade boat, the Hazel Rig, from an early age Peppercorn showed a determination to be independent, to make his own way in the world, and equally determined was he to give as much help to as many as found themselves in similar straits as he could. Hence, why he now played mother and father to his very own gaggle of waifs and strays. Having spent the morning on the Bitter Hope, netting fish for grub, Peppercorn would normally take his crew in the Farthing out upon the lake in the afternoon in order to catch some fish of their own to augment their meagre earnings. But not today. Today, Pepper would make his weekly trip across the city to the Sinistrel to pay halfpenny's guild fare to Nodnell. Nodnell's shop was a tall, narrow building, no more than a single door and a window wide, standing 3 stories high, squeezed between a milliner's on one side and the Dwarf and Dragon public house on the other, with only the narrowest of alleyways between them, all 3 situated on Thimble Lane off of Tumblehome Row. Halfpenny was not Master Nodnell's only apprentice. There were 4 girls in all who lived with the Master Tailor and his wife, 4 of which Halfpenny was the youngest and, Peppercorn thought, the most skilled with needle and thread. The others were named Evelyn, Orla and Anthea, and each one lived with and worked for Nodnell, making tunics and shirts, gowns and cloaks for the folk of the city. Their families, with the exception of Halfpenny, who had no family to speak of, paying the old man and his wife for the pleasure. And while the girls toiled and laboured many long hours each day to stitch beautiful items of clothing, the monies raised from their sales was Nodnell's too. None of the money went to the girls themselves. Indeed, their only recompense, beside their drafty lodgings and 2 thin meals a day, was the gift of a £1 fruitcake on the first day of the year and permission to spend the morning of that day with their families. Every other day of the year, spring, summer, autumn or winter, they could be found in the little house and workshop on Thimble Lane, sewing until their young fingers bled from needle pricks. And when not sewing, they were instead sweeping, scrubbing, helping with the laundry, cleaning out the hearth or any other little job of housekeeping that Mrs. Nodnell saw fit to give them. Now, Peppercorn did not like Nodnell, did not like him and did not completely trust him neither. He was a thin and angular man, almost cadaverous in appearance, and he looked to Peppercorn to be one of the oldest people he knew, despite how nimble his bony fingers were with a needle. True, you cannot hold it against a person they are old and thin and crooked in appearance, nor that a dewdrop hangs forever on the pinched tip of their pinched nose to be noisily sniffed up every half a minute, only to reappear again half a minute later. But that was not it. That was not why Peppercorn did not like the tailor, at least not the only reason. No, there was something more. Nodnell was an unkind man, haughty and arrogant. He was hard and uncaring with the girls in his charge, using them in the manner of slaves, and he looked down his dripping nose at Peppercorn, scorning him because of his lowliness. "You here again, boy?" he would say, sniffing and looking with distaste whenever Peppercorn called to pay halfpenny's bill. He only ever called Peppercorn boy, and led him only begrudgingly into the workshop, never into the parlour, mind, though he was always happy to take his money each week. Arriving at last on Thimble Lane, Peppercorn presented himself at the door of the tailor's workshop, and gave a sharp rap upon the door frame, then pulled upon the cord that rang a bell within. At length the door was opened by Nodnell himself. "You here again, boy?" Nodnell said, seeing Peppercorn at the door, and then sniffing disparagingly. "Here to pester Halfpenny, no doubt, and keep her from our work, I shouldn't wonder." And he opened the door barely enough to admit him entry into the workshop. Instantly Peppercorn felt his dander rise, but he said nothing and pushed his way instead into the room where the girls sat at their work. They did not sit at chairs for their work, but cross-legged upon a low, long table on which were laid out the various pieces of whichever garment they were each working on. Seeing Peppercorn enter, Halfpenny jumped to her bare feet and ran toward him. "Oh, Pep!" she cried, and she threw her young arms around him in an expression of genuine love, the like of which was rarely seen at the tailor's establishment. "Come on now," insisted Nodnell, indicating with a yardstick that Halfpenny should return to her work. "There ain't no time for idle prattle. That chemise won't be a stitching of itself now, will it?" Okay, said Peppercorn, not liking the way the tailor wielded the stick, suspecting he had used it before to discipline the girls. He couldn't help noticing how the other 3 girls had all looked up at him with a smile when first he'd entered, only to look quickly back down at their work once Nodnell had lifted the stick. Turning his attentions once more to his ward, Peppercorn asked, "How are you faring, Halfpenny?" And he held her out at arm's length in order to get a better look at her. "You look well. Are you eating enough?" This last question more for the benefit of Nodnell, who gave an indifferent sniff, than for Halfpenny. "I am well, Pep," she replied fervently, "and my stitching improves by the day. Only yesterday Madam Miller said how my flat stitch was as fine as any she'd seen, and looked to all intents to have been executed by the hands of a mouse or some other tiny creature." She beamed with pride at Peppercorn, and he smiled in return, proud of the girl's skills and of her gaiety. How something so young and fragile could be so full of cheer and light-heartedness, toiling all day in Nodnell's workshop, was beyond him. But she was a force of nature all the same. "You are a good and a clever girl, Halfpenny," Peppercorn affirmed, cupping her face in his hands. "Baldwin and the others will be so proud to hear how you apply yourself to your learning. So long as you are happy still, and he turned his gaze upon the sniffing tailor. "I'd be all the happier if you were able to come and visit me more often, Pep," Ha'penny entreated. "Now then," interrupted Nodnell, before Peppercorn could make any reply. "That's enough of all that. Come, boy, be about your business. We all have a job of work to do here." And at the mention of him leaving, Peppercorn watched as the light drained from Ha'penny's pretty eyes, and resignation settled once more upon her small shoulders. "Here, then," said Peppercorn curtly, holding out a coin which he dropped into Nodnell's open palm. "And here's a little something more," he added, dropping a second coin into the tailor's hand, "for a bit of meat or fish for the girls." And they each stole a fleeting smile of gratitude in his direction. "As you wish," sniffed Nodnell. "Now, if you wouldn't mind seeing yourself out, as I've already explained, we have work to be a-doing here. Ain't that so, Ha'penny?" And so saying, he turned his back on the boy to show that his welcome, if ever it had one, had now come to its end. Ha'penny threw herself once more at Peppercorn and enfolded him in her arms, squeezing for all she was worth. "Be careful upon the lake, Pep," she said into his chest, and then released him like one setting free a caged animal to go once more out into the Laketown afternoon. As he walked back along the northern walkway of Tumble Home Row, back toward the postern, he tried to console himself that she was learning a trade, a skill that would enable her to provide for herself in later years. He tried to convince himself that she was better off with Nodnell and his pinched wife than on the streets with him and his boys. Still, it did not sit comfortably with him. To Peppercorn, Nodnell was a leech like those other merchants and craftsmen of the city who made their fortunes at the expense of another's skill and labour, and he felt a renewed prick of shame that he had to work for grub. Once more, the mage rose early the next morning, having spent barely enough time in the small bed that was his in the Hope and Anchor to take the chill off the sheets. He did not return this time to the cloisters of the registry. Instead, after first visiting the kitchen for a sack of provisions for the day, bread, cheese, a jar of fig chutney and a small flagon of ale, he headed east toward the postern, taking a small ferry boat as far as the Naysayers' Tower, and then walking the rest of the way through the busy markets and bustling bazaars of the easternmost quarter. At the edge of the city, he arrived at the harbours of the Seine and Troll Gates, where congregated the boats of the fishing fleet. Here he sat throughout the day upon an upturned basket, observing the comings and goings and taking in the sights and sounds. First, as the fishing boats prepared themselves, bringing nets and baskets from tall net huts on the quayside, heading out onto the lake. Then, waiting for their return, watching as they unloaded their catches, lifting baskets loaded with fish into huge balance scales to be weighed by the provost men, their weights recorded in ledgers and the taxes levied, so much silver on the hundredweight, before being rushed off to the various markets. But he did not sit idly, passing the time. No, he watched closely, carefully scrutinising all that he saw, searching for something as diligently as he had searched the books and scrolls of the monument. What it was he sought, no one but he knew, and he kept this secret guarded, close to his chest, as they say. There had been a fine mizzle of rain that had come and gone throughout the morning, and by the time the fishing fleet had returned and the various crews, their job of work completed for the day, had melted back into the city, each one seeking out their favourite snug or tap room, he was soaked through, and so betook himself back to the warmth and fare of the Hope and Anchor. He repeated this excursion for the next several days until he was familiar with the morning routines of the postern, the hustle and bustle of the markets and the cries of the hawkers and vendors, the daily preparations of the various fishing boats at berth in the Troll Gate, the comings and goings of the provost men. He was soon on friendly terms with old Master Scoggins, the harbour master, beside whose brazier he would be invited to sit upon an old crate, sharing his tobacco pouch with the harbour master and puffing thoughtfully at his own pipe as he watched the fleet first leave and then hours later return again. Also from here he would watch the race to land the day's catch, to get it to the various stalls and shops of the city, and he passed the time of day and casual pleasantries with many of the characters who came to the harbour, including, on one or two occasions, the boy Peppercorn and several of his young associates. And it was this same Peppercorn who, when the mage made his inquiries regarding a boat and crew for hire, had been recommended for the enterprise. The fact that this recommendation had been made largely in jest, that the boy was an urchin in his ramshackle boat crewed by foundlings and orphans, did not deter the old man, and after several days of this same routine, he determined to approach the boy to ask if he would accept the job. He waited until the rush to land the day's catch had ebbed and subsided, and the boats were all secured once more at their berths, before he bestirred himself from beside Scoggins' brazier, and, putting away his pipe and weed, went to locate the boy. He knew upon which of the fishing boats he crewed, the Bitter Hope, and knew the sign of the red ring beneath which it was daily moored, but he doubted he would find the boy here at this hour. He found him, instead, after a little searching, seated upon the floor beside the wharf of the old harbour in the shadow of the Seine gate, an unlit pipe clamped between his teeth as he worked, busying himself about mending a very old and worn net. And as he worked upon this net, unaware of the mage's approach, a cloud of seagulls tumbled in a turmoil of swooping and snapping and taking off behind the moored ships. Ahem! The old man cleared his throat in order to gain the boy's attention. You are called Peppercorn, yes? And who might be asking, replied the small boy, looking up from his work and recognising the old man who he had seen of a morning sitting and smoking with Scoggins. He eyed Alessander with suspicion, noticing at once the heavy staff and the long blade that hung at his side. My name is Alessander, replied the mage. And what's your business going around asking people their names? Asked the boy, returning to his work. He wove the rabbit, the special bone needle used for repairing nets, deftly in and out of the knotted mesh, pulling and knotting at intervals. The old man could see where the net had been repaired thus many times before. Alessander did not answer the boy's question. Instead he said, You have a boat? In what the boy thought a very accusatory tone. And what if I do? Asked the boy, with still a sharp note in his voice. I should like to hire it, and you as well, and as many crew as are necessary for the task of sailing it. Is it for hire? Anything in Laketown is for hire or for sale, replied the boy, adding pointedly, for the right price. Oh, I have gold enough for your needs, and I have some important work for you to do, work for which I will pay you handsomely. The boy thought for a moment, his eyes narrowing suspiciously. What kind of work? He asked. I won't do no smuggling, not for you or nobody. I am no brigand, sir, I am an honest fisherman. Yes, I understand, assured the old man. Do not fear, there is nothing criminal in what I ask of you. Well, I suppose that's okay then, just so long as we've got that straight from the push-off. It's more than my life's worth to get on the wrong side of the provost men. I had enough trouble with them already, I have. I am looking for partners to join me in something of a venture, the old man went on. I have no time for ventures, the boy replied, returning his attention to his work. I have fish to catch and mouths to feed. And so saying, he nodded in the direction of the small boat berthed at the quayside, upon whose deck a gaggle of boys now busied themselves, all apparently of an age with Peppercorn, all preparing the vessel for its afternoon voyage. No time for the present, agreed the man. I can see you are busy enough, but mark you, this is not the kind of offer you can afford to turn down. And why is that? Asked the boy. What's in it for me? Part share in a venture which for you and your little band of ragamuffins, and he looked pointedly in the direction of Peppercorn's crew, who still busied themselves aboard the little boat, could prove very lucrative. Peppercorn didn't know how he felt about being called a ragamuffin, not by a complete stranger, but was willing to overlook it in the light of the mention of remuneration. Having finished the repair, trimming off the loose ends of thread with a small sharp knife that he returned to a sheath that hung about his neck, he stood up and looked properly at the old man for the first time. Though the boy was short, the man was himself stooped a little with age, his shoulders rolling forward and his head hanging low, so they stood almost eye to eye. And as Peppercorn searched for a moment the moist, roomy eyes of the old man, he thought he felt something stirring deep down in the pit of his stomach, something like a spark of recognition. Of course, he did not recognise him, not truly, not beyond the few times Peppercorn had seen him sat beside Scoggins, for they had never before met, not properly made each other's acquaintance, at least not in this life. Still, it softened the boy's disposition toward the old man, and he put down his work to pay attention to what he said. It is a little late in the day, don't you think, to be going about your fishing? Asked the old man. The other boats have been back in harbour for some time already, their catches unloaded and sold, I shouldn't wonder. True enough, confirmed the boy, and I know it to be so, for I was with them when they put out this morning, and when they returned again this noontide. I have been out once already with my master. Now I must go for myself. Does your master not pay you for the work you do? He asked the boy. Master Grub pays me, the boy replied, but it is not nearly enough, neither for the work I do, nor indeed for my needs. Then I will detain you no longer, said Alessander. I can see you are busy. Listen, he added, I am lodging at the Hope and Anchor in the district called the Sunstrig. I know the place, assured the boy. Then come this evening and have supper with me, and I will outline the details of my venture. And so saying, he pressed a small silver coin into the boy's hand, which, after biting it to test its veracity, Peppercorn tucked beneath the waistband of his breeches. 'Twas early evening when the farthing made berth once more amongst the fishing tubs of the postern, but the fates, or those gods who concerned themselves with the industry of fishermen, had not been kind, nor had they smiled benevolently upon the boat's young crew, for their nets had yielded them little harvest, and they returned to Laketown hardly better off than when they had left. It was no accident that the rest of the fleet sailed at first light, dropping their nets when the fish were feeding in great shoals toward the water's surface. Once the sun reached its zenith, the fish were wont to retreat to the cooler, deeper water at the lake's bottom, beyond the reach of fishing nets. As a result, they had caught but the odd dawdler, whose leisurely descent they had interrupted, but no more. When the boy and his crew found the mage that evening sitting by the light of a candle in the snug of the Hope and Anchor, they could see from the debris on the small round table at which he sat, namely a plate with a clean chop bone, the remnants of some parsnips and gravy, and a half-drained jug of beer, that the old man had eaten already. There were 6 young men in all, including the one called Peppercorn, who it seemed was their leader of sorts. As they entered, sheepishly and a little awkwardly into the warm snug, looking out of place and about as comfortable as a spring lamb in an abattoir, the old man looked each one up and down, marking them in turn and weighing them in his mind. Peppercorn was the shortest of the 6 by an inch or 2, though he seemed no less self-assured for all that. Beside him came a tall and gangly boy with a buck-toothed grin that seemed painted permanently onto his face. Then there was one with straight black hair and brooding eyes that contrasted with an alabaster complexion. One was what you might call fat, if you were calling a spade and not standing on ceremony. One had a shock of blonde curls that tumbled in an unruly mop from his head, and the last of them had black hair, which had been impeccably oiled and combed. The boys in turn gave the old man a proper going over, making a mental note of his humble clothes that had clearly served him for some years and were well patched and threadbare in places. "How fared your fishing?" the mage asked, once they had reached his table, turning his attention to the long pipe into which he had begun thumbing a twist of pipeweed. "Not so well," admitted Peppercorn, "though I have made inquiries about you," he said, changing the subject. Elisanda did not doubt the boy had been talking to Scoggins. "They say you are a conjurer or a wizard of sorts." "So some people might say," said the old man indifferently, "but I assure you I am no wizard." "Tompkins says you are a wizard," added one of the boys, the heavy-set one who wore his clothes like a sausage wears its skin. "And he says he heard it from Nesta the net-maker, who heard it from Crowcake Narrowhands, who heard it from old Mother Peg herself, and she's not ever wrong about anything." The old man was genuinely surprised, if not a little gratified, to hear that his being at Laketown had been the subject of so much discussion and speculation amongst its residents. "Well, I can't honestly say I have made the acquaintance of this Mother Peg of yours," he replied, still paying little attention to anything but the pipe he was filling, "though I have no reason to believe her anything but an upstanding citizen with unassailable wisdom, nor have I met any of the other notables you mentioned, despite their evident expertise on the subjects of me and my business." "Some say you are a dangerous wizard," continued Peppercorn. "And I suppose you can do magic," blurted out the boy with the yellow curls, who sniggered with disbelief. "You think that funny?" asked the old man, raising heavily browed eyes to the boy and holding him for a moment in his stare. "You think it improbable that there is one who might perform magic?" Feeling suddenly awkward under the old man's scrutiny, the boy soon stopped his giggling and shifted uncomfortably on the spot, looking down at the unswept floor. Releasing the boy from his gaze, the mage lifted the candlestick from the table and touched the flame to the bowl of the pipe, where it flared red as he sucked hard through the thin stem, producing a ribbon of smoke that threaded its way up to the rafters. "There is no magic," insisted Peppercorn, coming to his friend's aid. "Certainly not in Laketown, leastways." "No magic, you say?" replied the old man in a whimsical tone, exhaling a thick cloud of white smoke as he spoke. "Are you so sure of that?" Leaving no time for an answer, the old man stretched forth his hands, palms down toward the table. Then, closing his eyes, he began to mutter something, almost inaudible, in a language unknown to any of the boys. Then, all the while muttering in his strange tongue, the old man began to raise his hands, first 6 inches from the tabletop, then slowly, inch by inch, higher and higher. And as his hands moved up from the table, so too, to the amazement of the boys, did the cup, the jug of ale, the plate and cutlery, even the candlestick and the lit candle. At first they just shivered a little, teetering unsteadily. Then the chopped bone slid from the tottering plate and wax ran from the candlestick to pool on the tabletop. Then, as the old man's hands rose, the items lifted from the table, as if attached to his fingers on invisible strings, climbing higher and higher until they stopped, cup, jug, plate, cutlery, candlestick and all, hovering in the air before their very eyes. The boy with the curls gasped in sheer wonder. "Wow," he said, his eyes wide with astonishment. "I don't like it," said the fat boy, taking a cautious step backwards and nearly falling over a low stool in the process. And it seemed he was not alone, for others in the room, seeing this marvellous display, stood furtively and hurriedly pulling on hats and coats, left in haste, afraid of what they did not understand. The children, for that is after all what they were, though they did daily the work and shouldered the burden and troubles of grown men, stood aghast, marvelling at what they saw, enraptured for a moment by the unbelievable wonder of it, for this was indeed magic. "Are you so sure there is no magic?" asked the mage once more, opening his eyes and fixing Peppercorn with a searching stare. And again, before the boy could answer, the old man clapped his hands, and the items, released suddenly from the power that had held them suspended in the air, crashed back down to the table. Peppercorn wiped the splashes of beer and gravy from a nearby stool and pulled it up to the old man's table. He was convinced and ready to hear the old man's proposal. "Won't you introduce me to your friends?" asked the mage, returning to the business of his pipe. "My crew," Peppercorn corrected, as the other boys, following his lead, drew up stools of their own. "Quite so," the mage agreed. "Your crew." "This," said Peppercorn, indicating the boy with the golden curls, who had laughed at the idea of the old man being a wizard. "This is my first mate, Dimmock Thistledown." The boy smiled and nodded eagerly, clearly impressed with the old man's display of magic. "And this is Crescent the Neck," continued Peppercorn, introducing the buck-toothed boy. Now that his attention was drawn to it, the mage could see that his head did indeed sit atop a long, skinny white neck that appeared about twice as long as it needed to be. "How do?" Crescent smiled in greeting. "This here is Black Nickel," continued Peppercorn, indicating the boy with the blue-black hair, "and Baldwin Piecrust," and he pointed at the large, round boy who looked at least thrice the girth of the stoutest of his companions. "And this last one is Vane Giles," said Peppercorn, pointing at the only remaining member of his crew, "so named for being overfond of admiring himself in a hand-glass." And at this the other boys all laughed and gave Giles's neat hair a friendly ruffle, turning it into an oily tangle. "And I," said the old man, the pipe stem clamped between his teeth, "am Elisander, honoured to make your acquaintance." And he blew out a large smoke ring that quivered and grew as it made its way up to the rafters. "So, what is your business here in Laketown?" asked Peppercorn, coming to the point, now that the introductions and formalities were complete. "And where do we come in?" Before beginning, the mage looked furtively about, in case anyone else should be listening to their conversation, and seeing that those who remained seemed more interested in the contents of their tankards, so he began. "There is a certain something," he said in a hushed voice, "languishing at the bottom of the lake, and I mean to have it. I do not have a boat. That is where you come in." He took a puff of his pipe. "Even if I did, I do not know how to pilot such a vessel, being more a land than a water dweller. That is where you come in." Another puff. "I have no crew to aid me in the venture, no one to hoist sails or man the rudder. That is where you come in. And as you can very well see for yourselves, I am too old to swim to the lake's bottom and retrieve the item, and was never such a good swimmer anyway. Once again, that is where you come in. Furthermore, I wish to go out on the lake tomorrow to have a good look at the business in hand. That is where we come in." Peppercorn completed the old man's sentence. "Yes, we get the idea. And what exactly is this certain something in which you are so interested?" "I will explain all that once we are upon the lake," replied the mage with an air of mystery, looking once more about them. "There are ears all about here, and I prefer to keep my business to myself for the time being." "Suit yourself," said the boy, a little piqued by the old man's insistence on secrecy. "And what's in it for us?" "Do not worry yourself about that. Rest assured you will be paid well for your services," said the mage. "It is customary in the shipping business that payment is made before the vessel in question puts out," said Dimmock Thistledown. "Ah," said the mage, "that is where my requirements differ somewhat. You see, I am not in the habit of carrying ready cash on my person, not when travelling abroad, that is. No, I will pay you and pay you well once the business is concluded." Peppercorn thought for a moment. "It all sounds a bit fishy to me," he said, shaking his head. "I'll need to think about it," and his friends all nodded in sage agreement. "Very shrewd," agreed the mage. "Very shrewd indeed. Innkeep," he called out to Master Chubb, who was busying himself behind the bar. Hearing himself hailed, the innkeeper tucked his cloth through the waistband of his apron and wound his way through the tables to where they sat. "Yes, sir," he asked, rubbing his hands together and smiling affably. "What can I get for you?" "I find I have a hunger for cheese," the old man explained. "Might you have anything you can recommend?" "Ah, now then, let me think," said Chubb. "If I'm not mistaken, there is a wheel of Westfold poacher in the pantry, being fetched all the way from the western slopes of Rohan. A hard, sharp cheese 'tis that some find to their liking, good with an apple or a bunch of grapes, better still with a cup of porter to wash it down." Peppercorn's mouth began to water at the thought of the cheese. He had not eaten a morsel since the little meat parcels that the missus had given them the previous evening. "Ah, yes," replied Elisander, enjoying the effect that this talk of food was having upon the boys. "That'll serve nicely. Bring me the Westfold poacher. What meat are you roasting this fine evening?" "Well, you've already ate the last of the chops," replied Chubb, but there is still a haunch of mutton with onions and turnips roasting in the oven, should be about falling off the bone by now. Then there's a capon or two browning nicely on the spit over yonder, not to mention there's always a fish or two waiting on the cold slab to be floured and fried to a golden crisp. Elisanda gave a quick sidelong glance at his hungry companions. "And what about your partners here?" asked the innkeeper. "Will they be partaking?" "Sadly, they are not yet my partners," replied the mage pointedly. "Now, let's not be hasty," interjected Peppercorn, who had been nudged mercilessly both by Crest in the Neck and Black Nickel. "I never said I wouldn't do it, only that I needed to think about it first." "And," asked Elisanda, "have you thought about it?" "I should say I have," replied the boy, "and in the light of a wheel of cheese, a hunk of mutton and a roast fowl, I've decided I'll do it." The boys nudged him again. "I mean, we'll do it," corrected Peppercorn, getting his friend's meaning. "Good," cried the mage, slapping a heavy hand on the young boy's shoulder. "Good. In which case," and these words he directed once more at Master Chubb, "we would be happy to avail ourselves of the Westfold, a platter of the sliced mutton, some onions and turnips, and since this one here," and so saying he nodded in the direction of Baldwin Piecrust, "looks equal to the task of eating the rest of us whole, we'd best have ourselves a capon or two whilst you're about it." "As you wish," the innkeeper smiled, giving an almost imperceptible bow and heading back to the kitchen. And so the deal was struck and sealed, in the most amicable of ways, over cheese, roast chicken, bread, and a stone flagon of golden ale. And those boys taught the old man a thing or two about hearty appetites, for never before had he seen a cheese rind so thoroughly gnawed, nor a roast capon reduced so quickly to naught but bone and gristle. That night a second room was procured, accounted to the mage's purse. It was a small room, situated up rickety stairs in the attic of the Hope and Anchor, within the sagging joists of the roof, begrudgingly prepared, it has to be said, by Chubb, who muttered under his breath about how he was not accustomed to lodging waifs and strays, though Elisanda kept reminding him he was being paid for the pleasure. And so Peppercorn and his crew spent their first night in many, many nights in a bed, upon a mattress, albeit slightly mildewed and in need of restuffing, beneath a roof, albeit slightly leaking and prone to draughts. And though the sheets and coverlets were only cotton, and well used at that, not to mention threadbare and patched in places, still, to these unassuming boys, they felt as soft and regal against their skin as if they were best velvet, and they each slept all the more soundly for it.